Hello, welcome all to this great initiative by the Hellenic Centre, which in collaboration with the Society for Modern Greek Studies aims at introducing to you modern Greek writers whose work has been translated and published in English. My name is Liana Giannakopoulou, and I will be sharing with you today my thoughts on the poetry of Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke, who sadly left us earlier this year in February at the age of 81. I will be reading poems to you in full or extracts, and they all but one will come from the volume The Scattered Papers of Penelope, edited by Karen van Dyck and published by ANVIL in 2008. This elegant volume includes a selection of translations from well-known dedicated translators of modern Greek writing. I will be mentioning the names of those translators after each reading. Katerina is the daughter of Yannis Angelakis from Asia Minor and Eleni Stamati from Patras. Her godfather is none other than the very well-known novelist Nikos Kazantzakis. Many of you will know him as the author of Zorba the Greek, who encouraged her to write and supported her very first publication at the age of 17. She was born in Athens in 1939, but it is the island of Ahina that held a very special place in her heart. The family owned a house there, and you can see on this slide, you can see on this slide where Ahina is, south of Athens, in the middle of the Saronic Gulf, and some pictures of the family home where Anghelaki-Rooke spent her summers. And of course, where she went back throughout her life. This house was for her a heaven of inspiration, a writing retreat, a place where she would welcome friends, but also share her thoughts on the work of aspiring writers. She dedicated a poem to the island entitled Ahina, and you can see there the importance of it in her creative work. It becomes a space where time is suspended, where the imagination can be set free and the creative process can begin. It is in the translation of the poet herself with Jackie Wilcox. Ahina. Returning home from the sea, my mother and I always stopped to rest under the same olive tree. She would tell me the tale of the ant and the cicada, first lessons in restraint and wisdom, while above our heads the poet shrieked with passion in the sizzling heat. Mother, what winter do you mean? What misfortunes? What cold and hunger? The miracle is this: it starts with the heat, ends as soon as day enters the shadows. The seeds are surrounded on all sides. It's the ant who finds them, while the mindless grey creature falls silent and freezes. Poor mother, you gave birth to a cicada who is incapable of hoarding. At daybreak, I would sneak out of bed, dragging my nightgown over plants and ditches. I saw the garden as an endless domain, the hens important personages absorbed in their pecking. Time in the summer had no meaning. The field was eternity, the water wheel turned its infinite round. I dived into the hay, rolled between the horse's legs. All joys ended at the sea, and there new ones began. Even then, I had fashioned two selves, the one sitting peaceful and snug and well disposed to all around, the other thrilled by the danger an unknown body hides. I called the winter peace, the summer madness, and turned into an angel in winter, a devil in the heat. Mother was shocked by my two natures. I blame the two worlds, she said. the apartment block and the island. But winter is coming soon. What can she do? She'll have to settle down. Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke studied foreign languages and translation at university, and she was fluent in Russian, French, and English. She was an acclaimed translator of, among others, Dylan, Thomas, Shakespeare, Anna Akhmatova, Marina Tsvetaeva, and of course Alexander Pushkin. She actually speaks with great pride of her translation of Eugene Onegin. And of course her own work has been translated in many languages, among them French and English. And you can see here some volumes of English translations. I met Anghelaki-Rooke many years ago in 2008 on the occasion of the launch of this book from which I have been reading to you today. And I remember how loud, how lively and fun and boisterous she was. She certainly lived her life to the full. And I think that this sense of unconstrained vitality is reflected in her poetry. This is all the more admirable because it is resting, as she says herself, on pain, on a wound. And this is something that she makes abundantly clear in the poem, The Scar. I will read to you now in the translation of Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke and Jackie Wilcox. The scar. Instead of a scar shone over my birth. The pain my uncongealed body suffered pushed me back into the original darkness. I crawled on nothingness, my tiny fingers clutching death like a shiny black toy. I don't remember how I came to blossom into a wound, how I learned to find a balance between puce and my open eyes. But at the point where my mother had assumed that like a leaf on the water, I'd be carried off on my first journey by the stream of death, she unexpectedly saw me emerge from the dark. Who knows what exchanges were made that night, what I gave and what I took, what I renounced, what I was promised so life would keep me in its service. Was it blackmail, agreement, or threat? Should I be grateful for the butchered gift of existence or vengeful? Had I been ordered to look up or to cast my eyes down to the roots of forgiveness? Forgiveness for what? What was this crushing weight that had exhausted me even before I had set off? Or had I taken up another burden that I'd carry limping to the end? I lived and I began to play. Trustingly, I leaned upon the brace and climbed the stairs. In the attic, I built the kingdom of my dreams with paper cutouts. I called it Florence, my magic city with its delicate ladies and gentlemen in hats. Next to the door stood the water tank that thundered now and then above the insubstantial actions of my heroes. The warmth of this world drifted up from below, the kitchen filled with smells, familiar sounds, household voices. What time is it? Have you peeled the potatoes? The kitchen and my paper imagination. Can the two poles of my existence have been fixed so early? As you can see, she speaks openly about the health problems that have marked her from birth and which accompanied her throughout her life, causing increased disability. In the lines I just read to you, the poet wonders what kind of changes took place the night of her birth that allowed her to live even though she brushed shoulders with death. Well, whatever this may have been, what I find empowering is the gratitude Anghelaki-Rooke feels when she speaks of her health issues, describing them as her ticket to the many precious gifts she has received throughout her life: happiness, passion, love, companionship, but above all, the gift of poetry. Pain and disability are perhaps one of the reasons why the body holds such a central place in her work. Another reason, of course, is because she was such a deeply physical and sensual person. A third reason yet is because, of course, being a woman writer, she wanted to put the female body at the very center of her poetry. Titles of collections and poems indicate that A Fair Desert is the flesh, Magdalene, the vast mammal, When the Body, poems such as The Body is a Triumph and the Defeat of Dreams, they all highlight the point I am making now. And many have observed, obviously, that the very first line of her first collection, highlights the centrality of the body again. She writes, "My body became the beginning of a journey." And what a journey this has been, full of adventures, full of knowledge, as her beloved poet Kavafi would have said, but above all, full of sensual perfume of every kind. Yes, because sensuality, eros, is in fact, in its most physical aspect, is in fact at the center of her work, and binds together spirituality and sensuality. In her prose poem, Writing, we can clearly see how poetry and lovemaking complement each other, how they are becoming part of each other, actually fusing into each other in highly suggestive and daring imagery. I will be reading it to you in the translation again of Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke and Jackie Wilcox. Writing. The obscene gesture I make when I take up my pen, while something stirs in the slight breeze, the skin of my nature. As when the poor soul slowly raised his arm and surrounded me with modest glory, his gurgling voice like that of a child reciting heroic verses before being put to death. His hand, with its bitten nails, slowly entered me until I became the motion of my own burial. That contact ended each poem. I bring my table and my papers to this new erotic landscape. I get down to writing. I set the machinery in motion. By the third line, my new inspirer has totally conquered me. I understand how he lives and how he saps me. My imaginings begin to be more than my actions. My hands sweat. I put down my pen, wipe the 3 fingers holding it on my fat thighs. Creation is in full swing. What I find impressive here, as in many other poems, is how confident Anghelaki-Rooke's voice is and how assertive it is also in relation to her own body and to the male body too. There is no inhibition, no reserve, no coyness. The poet Alicia Stallings was right, I think, when she emphasized how Anghelaki-Rooke's stance towards the male body opens up new perspectives in modern Greek poetry. That's absolutely true, actually, because we are usually, used to hearing about a male gaze on an eroticized, passive female body, where here we have the exact opposite. In Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke's poetry, we have a female gaze looking with longing and desire on an eroticized male body, as these lines, actually as the poem The Barbershop shows quite beautifully, I think. And again, this is in the translation of Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke and Jackie Wilcox. The Barbershop. A white rose, the barber's towel around your face, shining like a beetle, clinging to the petals. Clippings scattered on the floor were the days when I loved you so much, while the garrulous sculptor of heads cut away what time had made superfluous. Ah, that unscrupulous hand made you even more beautiful, the curve of your eyebrows more clearly defined, and beneath the jade of your eyes, your flowers, your lips half opened. The shop impressed itself on my mind in all its detail, and little by little, the nothingness which my life would soon become without you came crawling into the scented room. You smiled in the mirror, and I crumbled because I had you and would lose you, like life classically cut short by a pair of ancient scissors. I hope you like that. As well as subverting the traditional image of the passive and submissive female, what I also like is that we do not find in Katerina Anghelaki-Rooke's poetry the angry or frustrated voice that we would perhaps expect in the poetry of a feminist. I'm thinking of the case of Hilda Doolittle, for example. Nor do we find any sarcasm or cynicism or subversive irony as in the case of Carol Ann Duffy. Katerina loves men. She appears proud and comfortable in her relationships and happy in her marriage. In her interviews, she speaks with passion about the loving and caring relationship she had with her husband, Rodney Rooke, the classicist. She speaks with longing and remembers with great love how they met in 1963 when she was 24 years old, of their wedding a few months later in a little church by the Acropolis, and of the long and loving life they had together for 42 years before he died. And she keeps repeating that and emphasizing that he was very supportive of her and of her writing. Now, this is not to say that she is not aware or is not sensitive to feminist issues, because a feminist she certainly was. As Karen van Dyck, her translator, explains in the introduction from the book I have been reading to you today, her poetry can be seen to fit into the tradition of the best American feminist poetry, alongside Adrienne Rich and Anne Sexton, where writing the body and rewriting the myth become central concerns. Anghelaki-Rooke herself clearly points out in her interviews and in her writing to the challenges that women writers, Greek women writers, face in this traditional patriarchal society with its established, social behaviors. Male-defined social behaviors. She wants women to become free of all that. She wants them to find their own feminine identity in terms of their own consciousness. And this is exactly what she feels that her poetry is doing. Revisionist myth-making is unmistakable. For example, in an early poem of 1963, Iphigenia's Refusal. This is a long poem, and I will only read to you, a couple of stanzas translated by Sarah Ekdawi. This is a poem that is not in the collection that I have mentioned here. But note how the young princess refuses to sacrifice herself to the altar of a social order that perpetuates violence and death, and where women become victims of male ambition and military intransigence. Iphigenia said no. She said it was for love and purity of heart and peaceful little towns, and so that we could tend our trees, ready for rain when it came. It was for pastures green and for the angels. She said no. Let's not have fighting men. Let's leave our castle standing with lovely ivy on the walls. Let our children live to be old, and let there be joy. And she ascended into heaven. So it is clear, I think, here that the woman is not the vulnerable other of man, or the passive or the victim, but a confident, assertive human being. Anghelaki-Rooke insists, however, that her poetry does not follow any specific feminine theory, but being a woman, she can only feel and experience and therefore write as a woman. Better still, she is a writer who is very keen to share, to open up with us readers, the female perspective on creation. In one of her most iconic poems, a favorite of mine actually, Penelope says, the poet recasts traditional elements of the Homeric myth into her own female poetic. She does away, for example, with the traditional associations of female creativity with knitting and weaving, focusing directly and quite literally on writing. I will read the whole poem to you in the translation of Karen van Dyck. And as I read, please listen to how Odysseus' absence causes unbearable pain and suffering, because of course Penelope loves him, but also it opens up the space that allows her to develop as a writer and find her own identity and her own consciousness. It is indeed this absence that triggers the writing process. And also note that this is a choice of Penelope and not something that is imposed upon her. She says, I forget you with passion. This is something she's actually creating herself. Listen also on how ingeniously she's using the weaving metaphor to indicate how her rewriting of tradition is actually taking place. She speaks of cutting the threads that bind her to a particular man. Really, I think the threads that bind women to traditional perceptions and expectations, and her poetry hopes to free them of these bounds. Finally, see how the female body is at the center of it all, suffering pain and loneliness, but also becoming a promise of constant birth. I should say actually this before I read the poem, that in many interviews, Anghelaki-Rooke emphasizes how alongside art, it is the female body in its ability to reproduce that is the only hope that humanity has against death. And she compares this, of course, to the cycle of nature. So Penelope says, here it is, as I said in the translation of Karen van Dyck. Penelope says, there is an epigraph by Daniel Weisbord, and your absence teaches me what art could not. I wasn't weaving, I wasn't knitting, I was writing something, erasing and being erased under the weight of the word, because perfect expression is blocked when the inside is pressured by pain. And while absence is the theme of my life, absence from life, tears and the natural suffering of the deprived body appear on the page. I erase, I tear up, I stifle the living cries. Where are you? Come, I'm waiting for you. This spring is not like other springs. And I begin again in the morning with new birds and white sheets drying in the sun. You will never be here to water the flowers, the old ceiling dripping under the weight of the rain with my personality dissolving into yours. Quietly, autumn-like. Your choice heart, choice because I have chosen it, will always be elsewhere, and I will cut with words the thread that bind me to the particular man I long for, until Odysseus becomes the symbol of nostalgia, sailing the seas of every mind. Each day, I passionately forget you, that you may be washed of the sins of fragrance and sweetness, and finally, all clean, enter immortality. It is a hard and thankless job. My only reward is that I understand in the end what human presence is, what absence is, or how the self functions in such desolation in so much time, how nothing can stop tomorrow. The body keeps remaking itself, rising and falling on the bed as if axed down, sometimes sick, sometimes in love, hoping that what it loses in touch, it gains in essence. You can see here again how writing and the body are interlaced, but also how pain and absence are at the core of this creative process. Indeed, another constant of her poetry is the idea that art is produced to counteract solitude and the deprivation of a beloved person, indeed to counteract the ultimate of separations, death. She begins, for example, another very well-known poem of hers translating life's end into love with the following lines. Because I cannot touch you with my tongue, I transliterate my passion. Because I cannot take your communion, I transubstantiate you. Because I cannot undress you, I imagine you in the clothes of a foreign language. And I do like here the idea in the title of translation being associated with this recasting of emotions and experiences into art. The essence of her poetry, however, at the end of the day, is beyond gender, since I feel, and of course she says that too, it touches upon universals which, if any, have the gender of humanity. Just as every human being, she is vulnerable, like we all are, to time, illness, and death. And art seems to be the greatest weapon that counters these universal human challenges. I would like to finish this presentation with a reading of her prose poem, The Cicada, that brings us back full circle to the beginning of this presentation, the hot summers of Ahina, I mentioned there. With a poetic statement in this case clearly expressed, becoming at the same time another very interesting case of revisionist myth-making. In this case, in relation to Aesop's fables, because we are told that the cicada is not actually the irresponsible, carefree, lazy singer that Aesop has actually told us, but it is a singer, a creator, whose song is a cry of survival from the heat. So poetry, we are encouraged to think, is such a cry of survival. The creative drive is presented here as a suspension of time and a counterweight to death. The Cicada is translated by Gail Holst Warhaft. Thousands of summer songs accumulate inside me. I open my mouth and in my passion try to put them in order. Badly. But thanks to my song, I stand out from the gray, I stand out from the branches and from the other voiceless sound boxes of nature. My simple dress, gray and lime white, bars me from every excess of aestheticism, and so, cut off from the rowdy festival of time, I sing. I ignore spring, Easter, and violets. The only resurrection I know is when a faint breeze manages to stir and slightly cool the burning heat of my life. Then I stop howling, or as the world thinks, singing, because the miracle of coolness deep inside me says more than all I create, so as not to die of the heat. Well, thank you for staying with us. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. Goodbye.